Um, so good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another Talk Tuesday series in iHARP. And I'm really excited to welcome Dr. Lora Harris from University of Maryland Center for Environmental Sciences at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory to give a talk today. And she is an estuarine ecologist. We were just talking about her background, but I'm really excited about some of the community work she does also, bringing the science to the community. So with that, Laura, I'll hand it over to you.
Great. All right. Let me see. I did this supposedly seamlessly last time. We'll see if that is still the case. Can I get Vana? Can you see this okay?
Yes, I can see it.
All right, great. So thanks for giving me this opportunity to speak with you all. I'm located at the Chesapeake Biological Laboratory in Southern Maryland, part of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. We're a big distributed university. And before I hop into the topic of my talk, I will say, and let's see if I can make this work. I do have a paper in the Arctic that is not on what I'm going to talk about today. So of course I'm using that trick of just splashing it at you all. This is work that Amy Neely led. She was a PhD student with me. She's a scientist at NASA. And we were looking at thinking about phytoplankton communities under different sea ice conditions in the Chukchi Sea. So anyways, just to give you, I felt like I needed to validate or somehow say like there is an Arctic connection here. But what I really want to talk with you all about is the work that I do that I've kind of developed since this gift of tenure that some of us are lucky enough to get, of doing some work around social justice issues in the geosciences. And I'm really driven to do that work because, as you all know, we're facing kind of unprecedented environmental times. I enjoy this sign. It's very graphically pleasing, even if it's a terrible thing to think about. And you know, we can all debate whether the Anthropocene is real or not, but I think we all can agree that there's been a lot of change that we're navigating and experiencing, and certainly this group understands that. In my own world, in coastal and estuarine ecology, one of the things that I think we feel the most urgency about is the nonlinear responses of environmental systems, their propensity to have complete regime shifts, to have shifted baselines, to fundamentally change the structure and function of ecosystems. And in that context, to have the humans that are then thinking about conservation, preservation, management, policy, be struggling in this nonlinear environment. And so that's really from my oceanography ecosystem scientist hat. These nonlinear dynamics are something that I really, they do keep me up at night. And so the other thing to know about me as a human is that there's a real reason that I feel very welcome and productive at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. We're our own university within the University of Maryland system. We're the only environmental science university in the nation, so we're completely dedicated to that. And we have a legislative mandate for doing sustainability work with specific attention to the Chesapeake Bay. We're celebrating our 100th year next year. So I have a lot of pride and sense of belonging, which I'll talk about later, being at this institution that celebrates those of us doing this kind of applied, actionable scientific work. And we've published about this. This is a paper I did with some of my colleagues here about, you know, where we're going in estuarine science. And one of the themes from this essay that I want to pull out, I love doing these little literature searches. Carlos Duarte is very famous for doing these in oceanography, kind of looking at where the trends of our thinking are by diving into literature databases. And one of the things that we noticed when we did this around estuaries was a strong uptick in papers around management and papers around really, really challenging problems that we're facing in this Anthropocene setting. And so we have a whole theme in here, you know, trying to really get scientists in the coastal realm to be very cognizant of both the urgency and the needs we have to combine applied science with discovery-based science. And so I really have this ethos in myself that translates into the work I do, that we need to get rid of some of these dichotomies between applied and discovery-based science, and to really recognize that in applied research, there can actually be many opportunities for creativity and theoretical advances. We see this in my own field, you know, some of the basic understanding about nitrogen limitation in estuaries came from Dan Ruther's work on Long Island Sound, looking at duck waste. So, you know, there's a lot of opportunities for getting rid of these false dichotomies. And so I'm previewing and really just throwing all of that information at you, because as I've been doing that kind of work and working in estuarine science, really trying to solve problems, do science-informed management hand in hand with managers. One of the things I see in our own academic culture is this unhealthy kind of division between, you know, the value we place on science that's driven towards discovery and wonder versus solutions-based science. And I really don't think it's productive. And I also think that it has the potential to exclude people from our fields, especially those of you working with young people know that, you know, the existential dread of climate change that many young folks are feeling very viscerally is driving them into solution-based spaces in the science and the work that they do. And so we really can't afford to be having a hierarchy of science. And that's my soapbox about that. And I think it's especially critical to open up and widen the spaces and places we do science, because in the geosciences in particular, we have a really poor track record of broadening participation. So this was a paper published in 2018. So it's about, you know, it's a little bit older now, 6 years old, written by Rachel Bernard and Emily Cooperdock. They looked at the PhD rates in the geosciences, and they defined it according to NSS definitions, so earth, ocean, atmospheric, polar sciences. And what they found, which was very upsetting and still is that of all of the STEM fields, that the geosciences have made the least progress in diversifying our fields of any of the fields. We've had some progress around gender diversity, of increasing women, but for ethnic and racial identities, we have done a very poor job. And this is despite, and they raised this in the paper, this is despite decades of investment in recruitment programs for students. So we have a lot of wonderful programs here. I don't want to denigrate any of these. I was very much a part of Rising Tides. I have my own program called the Seas Islands Alliance that I'm also very involved with, that's student focused. So we need these programs, but these programs have been going on for decades, and we have not seen the shift yet translate into diversifying PhDs or our field in general. In the ocean sciences, it's particularly bleak. So, you know, up through 2019, for example, with Black and African American students, we were graduating 0, 1, or at most 2 PhDs per year. And, you know, you can see for the Latino community, we made a little bit of progress, but not much. So these are, in my field in particular, in oceanography, this is a big concern and something that we need to be thoughtful about. And of course, you know, that's kind of butts up against the reality that our coastlines in the United States tend to be more diverse than the interior portions of the country. So I had heard that kind of fact buzzed around for a while, but I had never been able to find a paper on it. And so we finally just like published a paper on it, where we looked at the US Census data in coastal and shoreline watersheds. So those are two different spatial scales. So we wanted to look at both. And we compared ethnicity and racial demographics in those county scale watersheds to the interior of the country. And so the graph on the left pretty clearly shows that these coastlines are much more diverse than the interior of the country. So we have this fundamental mismatch between our scientific community, which has not diversified, and then the coastlines, which are where we're doing a lot of our work, which are much more diverse. That also happens to overlap with social vulnerability of these communities. We worked with Chris Emmerich, who has a social vulnerability index. It pulls in a lot of different things, as all these indices do, and they're not always the best to use on a local scale, but on a national scale, they tend to do an okay job. And how do we interpret this? Well, the social vulnerability index on the coastlines is much higher. So folks in disaster contexts are going to be more vulnerable to negative impacts. And so that's something we need to think about when we do climate change science as well. All right, so hopefully I've set up the deck okay. You all know we're in the Anthropocene. There's all these problems. There's an urgent need for solutions. Let's get rid of this silly and not helpful applied discovery-based hierarchy of science. Let's recognize that the communities we serve, especially if we're doing coastal and ocean science, are very diverse, and that in the geosciences, many of us do not represent those identities. And so how can we solve all of these problems? And I am a firm believer, the urgency of the problems that we have, we need everybody at the table, and we in particular need the communities who are facing those challenges to be part of the solutions and to help us to understand what they need. And we have a culture problem. So this graph, I'm going to take a little bit more time since I've been erasing through the other slides, because I find this helpful to really get folks' mindsets now into the okay, science culture. Let's think about the culture of science. We know those recruiting programs didn't work. We know we have these issues to face. We know we have these communities to serve. Let's look at ourselves. And so if you look at the top graph here, let's imagine that the squares and the circles are representing academic culture. And let's imagine that that first row at the top is science as it was practiced, 100 to 150 years ago. Most of the folks coming into the academic culture were white men, and the push of academic culture was to create scientists that were all very similar, that were all professors, that were all doing science in a similar way. Sometime in the last century, we opened the doors more broadly to include more folks to recruit into the academic culture, but there was still this drive to assimilate. And I'm very intentional in those words. There's assimilation, which really demands people conform and fit into a very narrow identity. And then there's acculturation, which is taking on some of the cultural practices of that setting. And assimilation, we know from higher ed social science research, is much more difficult for folks to navigate. There are all of us who are in these settings. We code switch. I code switch all the time. If I'm in a room that just has men, I might act a little bit differently. But there are also some ways and spaces and places where that assimilation isn't possible. And so this second line, where there was maybe an open door policy, but the demand for assimilation, that's definitely recognized as like a point of challenge around retention. I think more recently, we're probably on this third row, where we're still probably demanding a lot of assimilation of folks, but we're also recognizing that there's different ways that they can be once they leave the academy. And so what my programs do, and this kind of work that I do within Aspire, which I promise I'm going to get to, is this bottom line. And really what we're trying to do is fundamentally shift the culture of science to increase sense of belonging, to change the spaces and places where science is done, and to understand that in doing this, this is an asset-based framing of that work, that we can accelerate solutions, that we can accelerate the science that we're doing, and that this is needed on multiple levels, from a justice perspective, from an inclusion perspective, and from the fact that we urgently need solutions. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, what does that mean? What does inclusion mean when we talk about it? How do we actually make sure that folks feel a sense of belonging? And belonging is important for trying to get to that red circle. And this is a very old social science concept called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But I think that this image is very intuitive. So if we think of all of our needs as humans as being first very much dependent on just meeting our physiological needs. Do we have clean air, clean water? Do we have food? Do we have safe shelter? Well, safety is the second one. Do we have shelter? Can we sleep, etc.? Let's just get our basic physiological needs met. Then we have the capacity to think about our safety needs. Do we feel personally secure? Do we feel financially secure? Do we feel psychologically secure? Is our health okay? And if we have those needs satisfied, then we have the capacity to think about our connections and social networks around love and belonging. And you'll notice that it's only after those needs are met in Maslow's hierarchy, if we have our physiological needs, safety needs, and belonging needs met, that we can really tackle esteem and self-actualization. And those are the places that we generally think of people having the capacity to be very creative and very productive around intellectual pursuits. And so creating a culture and a space where we can have these three bottom needs met is fundamental to ensuring that folks can, live productive lives and contribute to society. So this is one way of framing belonging. It's one way of thinking about what inclusion actually means for belonging of folks, and it's very important for the work that we do. There's lots of other different models. I'm not going to go over them. You can just like numerical modelers, because I do numerical modeling, you have the simple one in social science, and then you have the, here's everything. And so those are the principles. I give you kind of like the basic framework foundation for what we're doing with Aspire. Urgent problems, not everyone's at the table, the people we serve aren't at the table, and our culture is exclusionary, and that really prevents our capacity to do our best work. And so about 8 years ago, the National Science Foundation had a group called the Geoscience Opportunities for Leadership and Diversity, and they held an ideas lab. I don't know if any of you have participated in an ideas lab. It's this facilitated brainstorming that a group called Known Innovation has really brought up with NSF, and NSF does a lot of these. It was kind of a terrible thing to do with folks working on equity issues. There's a lot of tears and drinking in the bar late at night. But the good thing that came out of this is they had us pitch ideas. And Aspire was selected for seed money for a demonstration project. And Corey Garza led that first iteration of Aspire. And these are my collaborators. So Corey is currently at University of Washington, so is Julia Parrish. Julia does a ton of citizen science leadership work with the Coastal Almanac and Coast. We collaborated with Julie Passelt, who literally, she wrote a book called Equity in Science. She's a higher ed organizational change specialist and also does work on leadership theory. Marco Hatch is at Western Washington University. And Raj Pandya, who was at the time was with the Thriving Earth Exchange at AGU. And our idea for Aspire was to think about broadening participation through work with communities. So to really cultivate co-production as a mode of doing science, as a way of reframing and rebranding how we do geosciences, to make it truly socially relevant and to broaden participation in these fields. And so many of the hallmarks of the early Aspire are in our currently funded program, and so I'm going to just kind of walk you through it. One of the big components and ideas behind our work is that to do this work, you have to go out into community. It's really not fair to the community to ask them to come to you. And so we supported many grants to mobile working groups that had 10 to 12 members. They were composed of both community members from a local community as well as boundary spanners. And a boundary spanner, by our definition, is someone who has a foot in both worlds. Marco Hatch, who collaborates with us, is a good example of this. He's Coast Salish, so he's a member of a tribal nation. He's been a leader in really leading the clam gardening, indigenous clam gardening network. And he's got a PhD from Scripps, so he's really managing this braided way of knowing between mainstream and indigenous ways of knowing, and working in both cultures. And so we've tried to think about this model of the geoscientist being the boundary spanner, but of course there are many other ways you can think of boundary spanners. There are cultural liaisons, there are boundary spanning nonprofits that serve as an intermediary between the academy and the community. But for Aspire, we're trying to get geoscientists to take on these roles of boundary spanning work. This is Marco's paper. This is an image from his work, trying to also really talk about the boundary spanner as someone with all of these different attributes: a braided identity, someone who's approachable, emotionally intelligent, resourceful, hears what others cannot, is committed, knows how to navigate and balance power, and creates space for the community to be valued. So if you can kind of start to wrap your mind around that, that's a big part of what Aspire is doing. We're really trying to elevate, support, cultivate boundary spanners within the geosciences. And these are some examples of the groups that we've supported to date. We worked with Jennifer Ungles in the University of Hawaii with some watercress farmers, indigenous watercress farmers, who were handling salinization in their agricultural fields. We've worked with Andy Aguilar in the LA River as he navigated many political advocacy issues around water quality in that system. And there have been a couple of other programs here that, I think we were helpful to, but we also learned that sustaining this work, as Vana mentioned when she was introducing me, this is hard work. This is like really, really, really hard work, and it's going to require us to think very differently about how science is done. At the same time that we were supporting these working groups, we also were working on social science research. And one of the big questions we were asking is, I'm gonna rephrase what's on this slide, is like, what's the special sauce? So if you're a leader and if you're a boundary spanner, what kind of attributes, leadership attributes, do you have that are helping you to do successful work? And so we collaborated with Julie Basselt and her student Deborah Southern, who's pictured here, to do a qualitative analysis with our boundary spanners from the mobile working groups. And so this early Aspire work resulted in 2 papers. The first was a commentary we had published in AGU Advances that defined this concept of equitable exchange. And we think of equitable exchange as a process of co-production that really has an ethical framework to consider bidirectional exchange and or centering in the margins of the community. So centering in the margins, what I mean there is centering community, thinking beyond the ivory tower to focus on community-led, community-first approaches. We also propose, the community-based participatory research has been going on forever. So, us calling it equitable exchange, okay, that's cute. But, what we really wanted to do here was to say, this is a mechanism for broadening participation. So let's take it a step further and say, if we can adapt this and fully make it fit within academic culture where the currencies don't often reward this kind of work, we have the capacity to really accelerate all those issues that I tried to set up the deck with. We can have more solutions, we can broaden who's doing science. And so that was a big part of this commentary. Deborah's work also resulted in a paper I'm really proud of, and this was putting a boundary spanner within the framework of both leadership theory and critical race theory. And what she helped us to do was to identify 5 key characteristics of boundary spanners as emergent leaders and cultivators of community-based participatory research. And I'll quickly go through those. These are elements that are now shaping our curriculum, and I'm happy to talk more about examples. I'll try to give a few examples so that you can dig your teeth into them. But this was something that was very common in all those journals that we had these boundary spanners keep. These were the emergent themes that came up of what they were reflecting on as being really important for them to do their work successfully. So the first of these is having a critical awareness of scientific history. Now, what is this? What are critical histories? What are critical scientific histories? This is a form of, this is a way of thinking about how we write our history and who writes our history, and recognizing that throughout history, many voices and identities have been left out of the stories that we share and tell and write down. And so we may not always know, especially for a marginalized community, what the critical history is that may impact our ability to work with them. So, I will give a very local example in that community members around the Chesapeake Biological Lab in the last century were coerced into psychological experiments. These were Black members of our community. And so if I go into the Black community here and try to engage with them as a scientist, and I don't have that recognition of their legacy of how they've experienced research in their own lives, then I am not going to be able to navigate all of the different trust building issues that will evolve from that relationship. So we need to have that understanding. This is very true in Indigenous communities that have a more holistic view of the earth in terms of their work with geologists. People going and taking rocks, taking materials from the land has a very different meaning in some of these Indigenous communities. And so that very act of geologists going and taking samples can feel traumatic. So if we don't have those understandings of what has come before, the injustices that have happened before, we can't properly situate and position our own identities within the relationship building. The second thing that these folks were really good at was centering community voice, active listening, really knowing how to do the things that Marco also identified of hearing what is said, but also what is unsaid, knowing who to talk with, knowing how to center their voice, not going to a community expecting me to have all the knowledge that I'm just going to give to these people. That kind of elitist viewpoint is just the opposite of what we need to do when we're going to communities to try to work with them. So hopefully that is pretty clear. The other 3 attributes we found were really about building relationship So all three of these came under that umbrella. What do you need to do to be able to build relationship? Well, the first thing you need to do is you need to be able to navigate multiple politicized relationships. And here, by politicized relationships, you can also substitute power. So how are you going to navigate the power dynamics? There's a power dynamic between someone coming in who's a professor, a doctor from the academy with the community. How are we going to still treat one another as human? There's the politicized relationship of understanding that community's role within the larger like government context. For example, I work in Vieques in Puerto Rico. And so when I go there to think that I would just land and not understand the history of the United States with the island of Vieques and be able to talk to anyone is pretty laughable. So, you would need to really understand those contexts. And then, of course, there's power dynamics and politicized relationships within the communities themselves. So who are you choosing to speak with? Who is the right leader to talk with first? Who do you ask permission from? Some of these things require some nuance and diplomacy that as scientists, we aren't always taught. Number 4 here is thinking about shared ownership and reciprocity. The National Science Foundation has new guidance for working with Indigenous communities, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about this with all marginalized communities that have had things stolen from them. But in particular for Indigenous communities, understanding sovereignty, understanding what that means in terms of data, and then just generally thinking about what is reciprocity in this relationship? What does this look like so that we can build trust and not be extractive parachute scientists. There's a great paper that characterizes, some scientists who have this propensity for like flying to lovely places and parachuting in, collecting data and leaving. And that's very extractive work. And that does cause harm. So thinking about reciprocity as a guiding principle for the work. And then finally, this is my favorite because it's, well, it's just a little bit, I think intuitive, but also something that drives me to do the work when I do the boundary spanning work, and that's the idea of care. And now care can be a very kind of maternal way of working with people, knowing people's kids and grandkids' names and bringing them food and sharing something that you found that you think is beautiful and building that kind of friendship and relationship. And care can also be justice. Care can be understanding the advocacy needs of that community. Care can be feeling righteous alongside those community members. So it can be both things. And oftentimes I think both are needed. So we used this set of social science findings around boundary spanner leadership to drive the creation of a curriculum. And this is offered as the Equitable Exchange Virtual Discussion Series. We will be, I think this website is down right now because we're relaunching it because we're going to be offering this beginning in February. Raj Pandya is no longer at AGU, but when we first developed it, he was still there. So we'll be developing it again with Raj, but now he's at Arizona State. And I love doing this. We developed this during the pandemic. It was like the best thing about the pandemic for me. And we did this work with all of the folks who worked on Aspire, but also the names who don't have affiliations in the middle are largely community members and also some Indigenous scholars who collaborated with us to really make sure that this had the grounding in community rather than just having all the academics who are on the left side of the names involved in creating the course. And so we used all of those leadership traits. You can see them very transparently: critical scientific history, centering community, navigating multiple politicized relationship, ownership, reciprocity. Dominique David Chavez did that session. It was beautiful. And facilitation and care. So again, we're going to be offering this again with Aspire in February, and I hope that I can get the word out through iHARP if any of you are interested in joining us. We do hope that people will commit to attending at least 4 to 5 sessions. But we promise that these are very engaging. So we usually have a spark, someone who gives a short talk, and then we do a facilitated discussion. And then there's time for the community members to reflect and talk and have a discussion. And we find this is a very safe space for people to learn about topics that can be kind of intimidating if you haven't done this work before. So Aspire 2.0 is funded again. We've expanded the group of folks who are involved. I don't know why Raj, I would have to press an extra button. So you'll see some familiar faces from our first iteration, but we've added ethnographer Natalie Beloy, Kat Davis, who works with me here at UMCS, is joining and running a community of practice. Carilla Skews, our evaluator. We're working with Fred Tutman, who's the Patuxent River Keeper, and Daniel Aguirre, who is a community organizer who has an organization called Pueblo Engage. Oops. And so this 2.0 version, I want to make sure there's time for discussion. And so I'll just flash some stuff at you. But we're really focused here on both early career scientists from the final year of PhD to assistant professor level. So not students, really. I mean, that final year PhD who's involved would have to be very special and really want this. We're mostly hoping for postdocs and assistant profs. And then in this next iteration, we also have a cohort of, I think the wording of this is changing, but we had called them change makers. These are folks in leadership positions. And so we're trying to affect change at two different levels. The first, in the professorate, we have, if you look at leadership theory, we have what's called reputational power. We can use our influence and our reputation to push towards change. Whereas associate deans, presidents, chairs, et cetera, they have authoritative power to try to change things through policy. And so we're trying to help to create a cohort of those kinds of people so that the actual academic currencies that we're using to reward these types of people might also expand and help. And so I haven't, this is one of the first talks I've given on Aspire 2.0. So mostly what you're going to see now is notes to myself so that you'll just, and I'll go a little slower than I've been speaking, but you've heard about our virtual discussion series. This is kind of the entry point into Aspire. It's kind of low investment of time and commitment because you can just turn on your computer. People who do the VDS will be invited to be part of the Immersive Institutes, and this is a 1-week community intensive. It's co-created and co-taught by a host community. Our first community will be the Duwamish of Seattle, and they're going to really be leading the participants during the day, and the academic part of this is more, we're just doing some facilitated self-reflection so that folks kind of get that in their toolbox as well. I don't know why this formatting came out funny, but the third component of Aspire are those working groups that I talked about. So we will again be funding those small working groups, and they have to have the boundary spanner, they have to have the community member, they have to take place in community. And then this innovation incubator for the geoscience leaders, for the change makers, is trying to help them build a portfolio of change, because we recognize, and NSF pushed us to recognize, that we can't just handle the early career folks without also making sure the spaces where they're doing the work become more welcoming. And then finally, Kat and I, along with Daniel Aguirre, are facilitating a community of practice for the folks who've been through all of this. We don't want them to fall through the cracks, and we want them to feel like there's a space and a place for us to continue to support and offer them connection with one another. So this is kind of our, gosh, we're playing with, I don't know how you guys have done it at iHARP, but trying to figure out how to visualize all of this. But we're really trying to think about how Aspire can push into the future. There's going to be all these opportunities coming up. We are, our second Immersive Institute will be in Alaska with the Aleut of St. Paul Island. And so that's one of the reasons I wanted to connect here, because we are looking for folks who are doing this work in Alaska to be participants. And that will be, it's not our first, but it will be soon after, because we're trying to get 2 of them done in the first year. So with that, I will go ahead and end so that we have time for questions. And it's always weird in Zoom because you're just talking into the void. So I could have been like on mute the whole time and not have known. But thanks for giving me a chance to chat, and I'm happy to answer questions and talk more.
Thank you so much, Laura. If folks want to either speak up for questions or put it in the chat, I can facilitate the Q&A. And while people are thinking about that, there's so many things that I could ask, but I'm just going to start with something very basic to understand. You mentioned reciprocity. It's a big concept, and it's contextual, you know, depending on which community you go into. Could you give a couple of examples, or maybe one example? What does that look like in a science community? Because I think what I'm hoping to get at is people do a lot of good science, but how does it go to the community? But then what does the community take from it or bring back? I'm just trying to understand that concept a bit more.
Yeah, so there's kind of a gradient, and I'm happy to share a paper that Dominique David Chavez wrote, where it shows kind of a gradient of community co-production. Her example is particular to indigenous communities, and it goes from like completely extractive, you know, those parachute scientists who come out of a plane, take their samples and go home and never interact, versus indigenous led. I tend to be more in the middle in a collaborative framing when I try to do work with communities. But I'll give you like 2 different examples. So in Puerto Rico, when we talk with folks in Vieques, like there's a lot of people who want to go there and study this bioluminescent lagoon. And we're among those peoples. We really want to understand what the drivers are for bioluminescence. And some of that science will eventually, but it isn't now, be useful for like the ecotourism kayak operators who are, you know, really leveraging that biobay into a lot of economic resources for the community. But it's going to take us a while to get there. And so one of the conversations we've had with Mark Martin Bra, who is also a co-author on the Equitable Exchange paper, is, you know, well, what would the community really need? And how could we balance out this inequity? Like, we're bringing these samples and doing these publications. And he's going to be one of the immersive institutes. And one of the things he's asked is for GIS help during Hurricane Maria and Irma. They didn't have all their roads named. So you can imagine what that meant in a disaster context when they didn't have telephones and internet. They were actually operating on like ham radios to help get people help. And they didn't have like a fully mapped road system for the island. And so how, you know, okay, well, we can try to start working on that or connect you with someone who can help you with GIS to make sure that this can happen, right? And so that's one example that I want to say is like sometimes the work that the community needs is not going to get you a paper, right? You know, and so that's where I think that we struggle as academicians of the currencies that we're rewarded with don't always align with what the community needs, right? And so how do we have those conversations? I think it's different, you know, you would get a different answer from different people when you would ask. With Fred Tutman on the Patuxent River Keeper, you know, he works with me on some of this, which is mostly educating geoscientists, but I'm always careful to be going and making sure my lab is working with his summer camp in the summer, contributing to education that he needs to fill in days for his summer camps. So we're trying to talk through Some of it can be monetary too, asking people, what do you need financially to enable this partnership? Because time is money for those folks as well. So part of it is learning how to ask respectfully and to listen to what is said and unsaid.
Questions? Christopher has a question in the chat. Are you familiar with Earth to Sky?
No, I'm not familiar with that.
Go ahead, Christopher, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, so much of what you were talking about, it harkened back to some of the people I was working with through Earth to Sky back in 2018, 2019, kind of stopped when COVID hit, but basically trying to provide a broader context from the NASA perspective to park rangers, in particular at Glacier Bay National Park, but Earth to Sky is much broader than that. But the place where I was connected to was Glacier Bay, and I know they have a very strong connection to the indigenous population in the area of coastal Alaska, and similar to your last story, what they mostly needed was the big picture, which GIS remote sensing can provide, and it's unfortunately a little out of reach for a number of people, especially in this case underfunded national park personnel for the interpretive division, but they some of the lessons that you're discussing sounded really familiar to what they were going through up there and elsewhere. And so there are people at Goddard who are the local leaders for Earth to Sky and ranging workshops and whatnot. And so I'm not sure I should introduce you, but at any rate, there a little online digging might be fruitful.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. I definitely admit to my coastal ocean bias, so I will take a look for sure. Yeah, and one of the things that I think I struggle with, I don't know, and I do this work, so, I'm finding ways, but when it is a community-led effort, sometimes that doesn't align with what we've decided we need to produce next to push the science forward, right?
Right.
And so that's for Aspire 2.0, that's really one of our big hypotheses that we're testing is, does my excitement about this being a mechanism for accelerating solutions, is that true? I'm excited about it, but I think there's still a need to put it into practice so we can figure it out. And there have been more organizations starting to support the kind of seed funding that helps you work with communities to develop those kind of needs assessment. It's not a full needs assessment, but just having the conversations and building relationship. A lot of times we're writing the proposal after we already have the idea instead of, after we've worked with the community for a while to figure out what they need. And so there's also kind of a timing mismatch with some of the community work.
The one distinctly beneficial thing that I think we provided to Earth to Sky was the fact that the remote sensing data that's available allows you to really produce a not long term, but a multi-decadal backstory to what what is right in front of your eyes now, and that I think is something that was kind of eye-opening for them up at the park, that so much change had gone on within their lifetimes, that it was shocking basically, and they visit with a lot of people on a lot of cruise ships in that particular setting, And so I think the message got amplified very, very successfully. And because we're all kind of local Marylanders in this crowd right here, I'll mention a little fun fact, seeing as we're, shall we say, thinking about elections of late. Not always a great topic, but the last time the Chesapeake Bay froze over below the 5301 bridge, the Bay Bridge coming out of Annapolis, was during the Carter administration's inauguration. So 76, 77, if I'm remembering the years correctly. And now the waters in the bay are simply too warm to have much bay ice of any substance except in the very backwaters. There was some additional significant freezing in '82, but it's been many decades since the Chesapeake Bay really had a cover of sea ice. So it's a strong visual depending on your audience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions? So I want to ask one more question if people are thinking through the questions. And this is something that I grapple with a lot, when we talk about these types of engagement efforts and, going beyond core science or foundational science. You mentioned the culture of academia is not very conducive to some extent. And you've thought of this far longer than what I'm doing in this 1 minute question, but are there ways that we can have more interest in thinking about translation to community or translation to practice of core sciences?
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's what we're hoping the change makers will really work on. Some practices that I think have been working are thinking about clinical models for the geosciences in the way that the medical community has also thought about them. And there have been, I know several now professors of practice who are not in a medical department, but who are doing this kind of community-based work and have found a niche within the promotion and tenure system of their institutions with that title. That's not to say that they don't always experience, marginalization by not having the practice behind their name, but it is one mechanism for saying we value professors of practice just as much, And I think that the other things that have been experimented with are really thinking through more innovative promotion and tenure practices. Different fields, if you look at different fields, they all have different ways of quantifying productivity. And so that's one of the challenges we're working on with Aspire 2.0 is, okay, if a typical publication rate for people doing true co-production might be 1 per 8 to 10 years with a community. And that's a career killer, right? So you kind of have to do both these days or wait till you're tenured. But there are other ways of evaluating and measuring impact and outputs for the community. And if we could incorporate those into P&T processes, how many community members met, how many management actions taken, if there was a way to quantify that in the way that it is for professors of practice or extension, those are some other ideas that we're trying to explore. So yeah, but it's definitely where I think we need the most creativity. We're also trying to create opportunities for both funding through our small grants. So if you're an assistant prof and you're first starting out and you're looking for that first grant to do this kind of work, that's a kind of currency too. Okay, you can get, there'll be $40,000 to $60,000 awards that we're giving for the EEWGs, which is a nice first little attempt at competitive funding to get yourself going. And also we're hosting writing retreats for folks in the community of practice that we are hoping will not only help them write papers that they already have in the pipeline, but cultivate a writing communities so that we can write impact papers in journals like Community Science, which are accepting different media for journal articles than, you know, the traditional hypothesis-based. And that's a journal of the AGU. So, you know, we think that that has enough status and impact factor to be, to make a difference in this way too. So we're trying to work at the journal end too, and Kat and Julia are both editors for Community Science.
It needs continuous dialogue on where to take this next.
Yeah, if you have any, if anyone has other ideas too.
I was also thinking about the fair and fair principles that are solidified in scientific data sharing, and also, you know, attaching or productizing every outcome. You know, there used to be this thing around data at one point that people would work on data, but then data was not considered to be valuable output. But now there is a lot more value attached to the data that you're producing from a project, and you know there are DOIs and they can be referenced and so on. They can move scientific directions forward. So I'm sure there are ways that, you know, some of these ideas from other lessons can be adopted here as well.
And some of it's got to be top-down policy, but some of it has to be just that, you know, is us as a community saying, when we're writing our letters, like, oh, well, look, you know, they have these 3 DOIs for data they produce. Actually, those data are housed with the community. Like, that means they're really doing ethical practices. Let's give them a +1 in our rubric on this, you know. So, you know, part of it's our collective work to recognize the extra effort this takes.
Thank you, Christopher, for sharing the link. Any final questions?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'll be using this this listserv to try to get the word out if you want to join us. This was very much me talking, and I promise the virtual discussion series is not. It's just an advertisement. So if you see that and you're interested in this more, I hope you'll join us.
Absolutely, yeah. Please share that material, and then, you know, if folks can sign in. There's some people who couldn't be in today. As I mentioned, we had another event right before this as well. But thank you so much, Laura. I really appreciate your talk. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.